Two S-400 launch vehicles and an Orion relay antenna sat inside a hardened compound on Crimea's eastern coast, positioned specifically to cover the approach corridor Ukrainian strike packages had used most frequently over the preceding 6 months. 4 hours before dawn, Ukraine's special forces reached all 3 targets in the same operation, using nothing larger than a single modified unmanned surface vessel that never once triggered the compound's own perimeter defenses. Here is the arithmetic worth understanding before anything else. An S-400 battery represents Russia's most capable long-range air defense system, a platform built specifically to threaten Ukrainian aircraft and cruise missiles at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers, tracking dozens of targets simultaneously, while guiding missiles against the most threatening handful in real time. Losing 2 launch vehicles from a single site doesn't simply reduce one battery's missile capacity by half. It removes a meaningful fraction of the coverage, protecting an entire sector of Crimean airspace. Because S-400 batteries operate in networked pairs and trios, specifically to provide overlapping coverage that survives the loss of any single position. Coverage that, with 2 launch vehicles from this exact site gone, now depends entirely on neighboring batteries whose own coverage arcs were never designed to fully compensate for this specific gap, stretched thin across a wider stretch of sky than their original deployment plan ever accounted for absorbing alone. Danilo Kravets ran the reconnaissance effort behind tonight's operation. His unit, designated Group 13, had spent 5 weeks mapping the compound's actual physical security rather than its documented specifications, work that required understanding not what the site's defenses were supposed to do on paper, but what they actually covered once real terrain, real staffing rotations, and real equipment limitations were factored into the assessment rather than the idealized coverage diagrams that existed in whatever planning documents Russian engineers had filed when the compound was first constructed. Before the war, Danilo had spent 6 years as a structural security consultant for a Ukrainian industrial engineering firm, work that had trained him to read a facility's physical layout for the gap between its intended security perimeter and its actual one. The difference between what a blueprint claimed a site could see and what its sensors, personnel, and equipment could genuinely cover once real-world constraints like terrain, weather, and staffing shortfalls were accounted for. Every industrial site he'd ever assessed in that old career had some version of the same problem. A security plan drafted by someone sitting in an office, working from a clean survey map, who had never actually walked the full perimeter at 3 in the morning to notice which stretches of fence line a tired guard on his 4th consecutive night shift genuinely paid attention to, and which stretches he simply drove past because nothing had ever happened there before. He had joined Ukraine's Special Operations Forces in 2023, bringing an engineer's patience for reading physical security the way most operators read enemy movement patterns, an instinct that made him unusually effective at a category of reconnaissance work most military planners considered secondary to more conventional intelligence gathering. He had proposed the S-400 compound as a target after a routine open-source review of Crimean infrastructure permitting records, cross-referenced against decades-old Soviet-era municipal engineering documents that had, through an accident of archival digitization, become searchable online years before anyone imagined those specific documents would ever matter to a military targeting assessment. Buried in a 1987 regional drainage survey, filed long before Russia's occupation of Crimea and completely unrelated to any military purpose, was a detailed schematic of the concrete culvert system built to manage seasonal runoff along this exact stretch of coastline, infrastructure that had existed, unremarked and unmodified, for nearly 4 decades before the S-400 compound was ever constructed on top of the same terrain. The compound's defenses reflected genuine institutional confidence in a well-established, heavily reinforced position. A dedicated perimeter security detail, working rotating overnight shifts, motion sensor coverage along the compound's landward approaches, and a naval patrol element covering the coastal water directly offshore, specifically positioned to prevent any maritime approach from reaching the compound's exposed seaward flank. The same general defensive philosophy that had, until recently, made coastal missile and radar positions across Crimea feel considerably more secure than facilities reachable only by land or air. A confidence built on 3.5 years of successfully repelling every conventional approach anyone had previously attempted against similar sites. Here is the specific vulnerability Group 13's 5 weeks of observation had identified, confirmed against that decades-old drainage survey and 6 weeks of commercial satellite imagery showing the culvert's seaward outlet at various tide states. The compound's motion sensor coverage, installed along the landward perimeter specifically to detect ground-based infiltration attempts, had never been extended to cover the narrow drainage channel running beneath the compound's eastern fence line, a concrete culvert built decades before the military facility above it, wide enough for a small vehicle to pass through during dry months, and never flagged as a security concern during the compound's original construction because whoever designed its perimeter defenses had almost certainly never known the culvert's full interior dimensions existed in any surviving engineering record at all, let alone considered it a viable infiltration route for anything larger than storm runoff. Group 13 spent the preceding 3 weeks modifying a Magura series unmanned surface vessel specifically for this mission, narrowing its hull profile to fit the culvert's interior dimensions with only centimeters of clearance on either side, a physical constraint that meant the vessel could carry considerably less payload than a standard Magura platform, forcing Danilo's team to choose their targets with unusual precision rather than relying on the kind of larger warhead that might compensate for a less perfectly placed detonation. At 1:51 local time, the modified vessel approached the coastline near the drainage culvert's seaward outlet, timing its arrival to a low-tide window that exposed enough of the channel's interior for the narrow-hulled platform to physically enter it without running aground on the silt and debris that had accumulated along the culvert's floor over 4 decades of largely unmaintained use. At 1:52:30, the vessel entered the culvert's mouth, running on a low-light optical guidance system rather than any active sonar or radar emission that might have alerted shore-based sensors, its operator working from a pre-mapped interior route built entirely from the 1987 survey's schematics, cross-referenced against a single reconnaissance pass conducted 2 weeks earlier by a smaller, expendable scout drone sent through the same channel specifically to confirm the survey's decades-old measurements still matched the culvert's actual current condition. At 1:54:09, the vessel cleared the culvert's full length and emerged inside the compound's own perimeter, its onboard camera confirming what 5 weeks of patient cross-referencing had predicted. An unmonitored maintenance access point roughly 60 meters from the nearest S-400 launch vehicle, positioned inside the exact blind zone the compound's motion sensor network had never been extended to cover, the culvert's interior outlet sitting behind a low retaining wall that blocked direct line of sight from the compound's own guard patrol route along the primary vehicle access road. Here is why the perimeter security detail never responded, and it's worth understanding the reasoning rather than treating it as simple negligence. The compound's guard rotation followed a standard patrol pattern along the outer fence line and the primary vehicle access road, a pattern built around the assumption that any infiltration attempt would need to breach the perimeter from outside, either by cutting through fencing or approaching via a vehicle access point that motion sensors and guard posts covered comprehensively. That assumption had held for the entire duration this specific compound had existed. because nothing had ever previously demonstrated a way to bypass the fence line entirely rather than breach it, and no security review conducted since the compound's original construction had ever specifically audited infrastructure that predated the military facility itself by decades. At 1:55:40, the vessel's onboard systems confirmed target acquisition on both the nearest S-400 launch vehicle and, in a secondary camera feed, the Orion relay antenna mounted roughly 40 meters beyond it, close enough within the same blind zone that a single, carefully positioned engagement sequence could reach both targets without requiring the vessel to reposition and risk detection during a longer approach. At 1:56:22, the vessel detonated its primary shaped charge payload against the nearest S-400 launch vehicle's chassis, the explosion disabling the vehicle's hydraulic elevation system, the specific mechanism that let the launcher raise its missile canisters to firing angle, and igniting fuel in its onboard generator, the resulting fire spreading across the vehicle's rear section within seconds. A second, smaller charge, deployed by the same vessel 4 seconds earlier and left in place near the compound's Orion relay antenna, detonated on a short delay timer precisely calculated to strike, while the compound's attention was still fully absorbed by the first explosion, severing the antenna mast at its base and collapsing the dish assembly connected to it. The second S-400 launch vehicle, positioned roughly 90 meters from the first, suffered fragmentation damage from the combined blast radius of both detonations, shrapnel, and debris punching through its own radar array's exposed housing and disabling its targeting systems without requiring a third, separate charge that the vessel's limited payload capacity would never have accommodated in the first place. A secondary effect Danilo's team had specifically calculated into their target selection when choosing exactly where to position each of the two available charges. Understanding that the culvert-constrained vessel's payload limitations meant every detonation needed to do more than a single, isolated job if the mission was going to accomplish everything its narrow window allowed. By 1:58, the compound's perimeter security detail, alerted by the sound and visible fire of the explosions rather than any sensor warning that had ever registered a threat approaching, found 2 disabled launch vehicles, a collapsed antenna mast, and no infiltrator anywhere within the fence line to engage, their training providing no clear procedure for a threat that had already come and gone before the first guard even reached the blast site, running toward a fire whose actual cause remained, for several confused minutes, a genuine mystery to everyone on the ground. The Magura vessel was already reversing back through the drainage culvert toward open water before the first guard reached the blast site, its narrow hull navigating the same decades-old concrete channel in the opposite direction, running now on battery reserve calculated with exactly enough margin to clear the culvert's full length and reach open water before the compound's broader security response, whatever form it eventually took, had any realistic chance of organizing a coordinated search of the surrounding coastline. The mathematics of tonight's raid, stated as plainly as any conventional strike in this campaign: 1. Unmanned surface vessel committed, 0 personnel engaged in any capacity, 2 S-400 launch vehicles disabled, and an Orion relay antenna destroyed. Russian losses estimated in the tens of millions of dollars against a mission that never triggered a single active defensive response from any of the compound's 3-layered security systems, not because those systems failed in any way their own designers would recognize as a malfunction, but because none of them had ever been built to watch the one route this mission actually used. Here is the strategic cost that extends beyond the visible damage at the compound itself. The site's remaining air defense coverage for this sector now operates without a functioning relay link to coordinate drone tracking data across the broader regional network, and without 2 of its own launch vehicles, forcing neighboring S-400 batteries elsewhere on the peninsula to absorb coverage responsibilities their own deployment plans never budgeted for, a redistribution of responsibility that spreads existing coverage thinner across a wider stretch of Crimean airspace than any single battery's original placement was ever designed to manage. That gap persists for as long as Russian logistics need to source and reinstall replacement equipment through supply chains already strained across the entire peninsula by months of accumulated strikes against exactly this category of infrastructure. Regional Russian officials reported, within hours, a technical incident at a military facility in eastern Crimea, language calibrated to avoid confirming what would eventually become impossible to obscure once satellite imagery and open-source analysts began cross-referencing the compound's known coordinates against visible damage patterns. 2 S-400 launch vehicles destroyed, a relay antenna severed at its base, and a compound whose defenses had performed exactly as designed against every threat category they were built to detect. Ground infiltration across the fence line, maritime approach from open water, aerial threats requiring radar tracking. None of them ever built to watch a drainage culvert. Nobody currently working at the facility had any reason to know existed in any detail beyond a vague awareness that storm runoff drained somewhere along the eastern perimeter. Danilo Kravitz filed the operation's after-action report before dawn, noting for future planning purposes that the compound's own construction history, the culvert had been installed decades before the S-400 battery itself ever arrived at this location, built for an entirely unrelated civilian drainage purpose that had nothing to do with any military consideration whatsoever, meant its blind spot had existed since long before anyone considered this specific stretch of coastline a military priority worth defending at all. Exactly the kind of pre-existing infrastructure gap that a purely military security assessment, focused only on equipment and systems installed after the compound's construction, would never have caught without the specific kind of patient structural engineering Reed Group 13 had spent 5 weeks building from documents nobody else had thought to search for in the first place. What he opened instead of closing the file entirely was a broader tracking effort across every other Crimean military facility built in the years following annexation, on top of pre-existing Soviet-era civilian infrastructure, drainage systems, old agricultural irrigation channels, decommissioned utility tunnels, betting that a vulnerability this specific, once confirmed to exist at one compound, was statistically likely to exist in some form at others built during the same rushed construction period when Russian military engineers prioritized speed of deployment over the kind of comprehensive historical infrastructure review that might have caught exactly this category of gap before it became something Ukraine could eventually exploit. Would you have targeted the launch vehicles first or the relay antenna first, given that both were ultimately destroyed in the same operation regardless of sequence? Or does the order matter more than tonight's outcome suggests, once you consider what might have happened if the compound's response had arrived just slightly faster? Drop your answer below.